lecture of the National Conference. Today we have Dr. Justin with us, and I'm so happy to invite you all again to this lecture. The moderator for today is Srija. She is a PhD scholar in her department, and she is working on Temple in 19th Century Cochin, Continuity and Change. Over to you, Srija, to take over the proceedings. Thank you. Srija, are you there? Srija, can you hear me? Maybe her call has dropped. Srija? Maybe
yes,
Srija's call has dropped.
Yes, teacher, I am here.
Okay, yeah, please carry on. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Shibana. A very good evening and a warm welcome to everyone joining us for the 5th session of the 7-day online national conference conducted by the Department of History, SSUS Kaladi, in honor of Dr. Paslithil and Dr. M.T. Narayanan on their retirement. The ongoing theme for this webinar is Critique and Constructions, Contemporary Writings on Histories of Keralam. This webinar provides a platform to interact with the new generation of historians and social scientists working on Kerala's past, bring forward a revised version of existing assumptions and delving into fresh perspectives and conceptualizations. Today we have among us one of the most distinguished scholars, Dr. Justin Mathew, to enlighten us on this topic. Before we move forward with the session, I will be reading out a set of general instructions for the participants. All the participants are requested to mute their audio and turn off their video throughout the session. Attendance of the participants will be recorded automatically. If any of the participants accidentally leave and are unable to rejoin the session, they can continue with us through our live streaming in YouTube. Also, if you have any queries in between the session, please send them to the chat box or as comment in YouTube, and I will read it to the speaker on your behalf at the end of the session. Without further ado, I will invite our PG student, Srivas, to formally introduce Dr. Justin Mathew and for the welcome address. Srivas, over to you.
Thank you, Srija, and good evening to all. On behalf of the Department of History, Sri Shankaracharya University of Sanskrit, we are delighted to welcome all of you to the working paper presentation series, which is starting today. Dr. Justin Mathew talk, Critical Geography and Rethinking the History of Urbanization. Dr. Justin Mathew is Assistant Professor at Hansraj College, University of Delhi. His research focuses on critical urban theory and historical geography of urbanization in the colonial context. His doctoral dissertation, titled Geographies of Accumulation, Nature, Infrastructure and Urbanization of Cochin, 1860 to 1945, perceives the development of port city of Cochin since the mid-19th century as a process embedded in the dynamics of capitalist accumulation. His writing and teaching focus on the issues related to colonialism and ecological histories. Sir, we are extremely honored to have you today with us, and we extend a warm welcome to you and also welcome to all the participants to the talk. Thank you, and over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, and very good evening. First of all, I would like to thank Professor K.M. Shiba for providing this opportunity to be a part of the one-week workshop on Critique and Constructions, Contemporary Writings on Histories of Keralam, in honor of Dr.A. Paslithil and Dr. M.T. Narayanan on their retirement. I extend my respect and best wishes to them on the successful completion of a stage of their academic career. This lecture is an attempt to reflect on the problem of urbanization in the context of the 21st century. This lecture is an attempt to reflect on the problem of urbanization in the context of the 21st century. Urbanization is the problem of the 19th and 20th century, Southwest India. Here I wish to revisit the field of historical urban studies that we inherited from the 19th century, especially in the context of contemporary process of planetary scale of urban transformation that we are experiencing on our everyday life. So the field of urban history emerged as an important field of historical research in the later part of the 19th and early decades of the 20th century. So in the context of the emergence of the metropolitan cities like Chicago, London, and Bombay, so this is largely in the World War I and pre-World War I context of large-scale industrialization and the metropolitan growth that initiated the field of historical urban studies. So urban studies that we inherit from the late 19th century understood studies, studies on urbanization as studies on cities. However, what we encounter now, the context of neo-colonial or neoliberal capitalism, is a complex landscape of contemporary urbanization. If you use Lefebvre's, Henry Lefebvre's term, explosion of spaces that's happening for last maybe 3 or 4 decades. So that, the complex landscape of contemporary urbanization makes the methodology of cityism, that is equating urbanization as a development of city growth. This early 20th century model of writing urban history has become obsolete. It's a not so useful category in the context of contemporary critique of urbanization. That means the existing historical studies on urbanization that focuses on cities offers limited analytical possibilities to understand urbanization during the times of neoliberal capitalism. So here, I draw heavily on a critical urban geography, critical geography perspective. This critical geography perspective allows us to revisit and revise the well-established and historically inherited notion of urbanization in the context of Southwest India. So Southwest India is known for some of the remarkable studies on urbanization, some of the remarkable studies on the port city development. There are studies on the long history of urban growth, the context of largely in the context of Western Indian coastal region. However, if you read colonial records and the official histories of the princely states or the Madras presidency or even Bombay presidency, this one of our important landscape, an important landscape that is central to the economic, political, and social formation of the modern Keralam, the Sahyadri Mountains, is depicted as historically inherited hinterland. Colonial writings and subsequently studies on urban histories, the context of Keralam, depict the hinterland or the Sahyadri Mountains as a free gift of nature, embedded in high mountains, slopes, and valleys, as fertile soil, materials, energy sources, food, and water. In a sense, we have a sense of wilderness connected to when we think of, when we analyze, when we understand Sahyadris, the image of wilderness or countryside, it's a dominant image. However, if you carefully see these 19th and 20th century archives that exist outside the state control, that provides a different picture. For instance, in the context of high ranges of Travancore, and the hills of Cochin, the plantation enterprises that developed in the later part of the 19th century appropriated these hills as spaces to produce coffee, tea, rubber, earlier, before that, Singona. So let me invite your attention to some of those images. For instance, this is an image from the high mountain near Munnar. What you see in front of you is a kind of, so that's the power station to operate one of the important technologies, communication technologies of that time, ropeways. And so soon after the World War I, when the motor vehicle was introduced in Kerala, in Southwest India, it was first introduced not in a metropolitan cities, as we understand, not in a kind of, inland towns, but the plantation capitalist preferred to develop roads and facilities to access motorable, the motor vehicle for the plantation hills, to facilitate, to access this metropolitan technology, to interconnect the fertile soil of these hills and the metropolitan capitalist centers, metropolitan consumer centers. And this is another important, this is, the ropeway station, a powerhouse. One of the, when hydroelectric energy production was introduced in Southwest India, it was first introduced in these hills, hills of Sahyadri Hills, the later decades of the 19th century. The princely states, government of Madras, and the planters engaged in the construction of dams, development of hydroelectric energy production technologies. And even if you go back slightly before that, the later part of the 19th century, boilers played a crucial role in industrializing these cities, industrialization, the metropolitan centers. The same technology was introduced. This was brought to, Munnar Hills, Travancore Hills, the later decades of the 19th century. Through Thoothukudi, via Thoothukudi, this was imported. And they also engaged in, dam construction with the help of modern civil engineering, the later part of the 19th century. And some of the, the modern technologies of the time, monorail, and later the late 1930s metal road, with the help of, civil engineering technologies. This was introduced the highlands of Travancore, highlands of Cochin, and elsewhere, the Sahyadris. As I have already we already had an image here of this ropeway. Installing this ropeway, operating this ropeway required technologies that were imported mainly from metropolitan centers. So what we see in front of us is a dense space of infrastructuralization that happened in the later decades of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. However, this geographical description that we encounter, the official histories, administrative records, and also census records depict these hills as countryside or wilderness. At the same time, we also need to acknowledge that these infrastructures facilitated uneven integration uneven appropriation and concentration of natural riches as metropolitan commodities. These princely states, the colonial administration, and the planters consistently engaged in diverting the natural riches as means of production, as commodities for the metropolitan market. So this was a process of integrating the hinterland, integrating this wilderness, integrating this forest as part of larger means of production, as a part of the global capitalistic restructuring that happened in the, during the times of colonial capitalism. So that means, these large-scale infrastructural projects that include roads, railway, ropeway, hydroelectric infrastructure, tea factories, coffee processing units, all these facilitated a flow of nutrients from the resource-rich hinterland to the metropolitan regions as food crops, raw materials, and energy sources. This process can be called operationalization of landscape. Operational landscape. They converted the appropriated capital, metropolitan and indigenous capital, consistently engaged in the process of appropriating and transforming this landscape, the hills, slopes, rivers, as operational landscape or as a means of production to expand the process of accumulation. And the story of the operationalization of landscape by colonial administration and the princely state through industrial redesign and transport and energy infrastructure developmental activities are treated as background infrastructures to facilitate primary commodity production. But how do we conceptualize this wide-ranging socio-spatial and environmental transformation that we're unfolding through the production of plantation agribusiness enterprises? Is it apt to depict the space of urban industrial agglomeration as wilderness or hinterland of a port town or port cities of Alleppey or Cochin or Bombay? Or is it possible to use the phrase the urbanization of Sahyadris, the zone that were depicted as remote, wild, and largely untouched by human impact? However, the phrase urbanization of Sahyadris appears as paradoxical because most of the 20th century urban histories rested upon the methodological assumptions that cities represent a particular type of territory that could be defined in opposition to rural, village, countryside, or wilderness, or non-city spaces. Cities as defined, urban historians define cities as neatly delineated, non-overlapping space surrounded by suburban regions, then villages, then wilderness. This is a universal mode of the geography of our city and urbanization we imagine. My attempt here is to elaborate this intertwined process of the making of urban agglomeration of Cochin and the conversion of Sahyadri hillscape as communication and energy infrastructures for large-scale plantations of coffee, tea, rubber by the metropolitan capital. I would borrow Henry Lefebvre's conceptualization of explosion and implosion, or extended urbanization and concentrated urbanization. My argument is that we cannot understand the process of the process of concentrated urbanization or the emergence of metropolitan city centers without understanding uneven, variegated process of extended urbanization. So therefore, I would argue the Sahyadri Mountains as the extreme zones of uneven urbanization. This perspective will allow the integration of the interior hills as a constitutive element of the urban agglomeration of Cochin, not just Cochin, that also include Bombay and also London and maybe Netherlands and other cities, Hamburg. However, I would like to point out that this lecture does not engage with the demography, morphology, or culture of the port city of Cochin. That's not the aim of this project, aim of this lecture. Instead, my attempt here is to integrate the non-city terrain of the Sahyadris as the constitutive element of urban or urbanization. What we call as the countryside, what we depict as countryside or wilderness has become crucial to the process of multiscalar, polymorphic process of capitalistic urbanization during the times of colonial capitalism. However, it is also important to point out that the study does not aim to present the urban as a central concept to explain every aspect of socio-ecological transformation of the hinterland. The concept urban, instead, is employed to reflect on the societal experience of uneven geographies of development that was produced through the contextually specific spatial practices, state regulatory authorities, for instance, PWD, and the hierarchy of the exchange relations. So therefore, I confine my study to the urban process under colonial capitalism to understand the specificities of geographies of uneven development. Geographies of uneven development is the process of commodification, capital circulation, and capital accumulation, and socio-spatial regulation in the colonial context that resulted in the production of uneven terrain. There's a simultaneous process of development and peripheralization, centralization and marginalization, interconnection and the production of fissures. So the central theme here is to revise the concept urbanization in the context of Southwest India. That can be applied, other different context. So therefore, just to repeat, the concept urban, the context of this study refers to a process, not a territory, not a territorial unit or typology of urban settlement. The historical studies on the colonial histories of Southwest India confined the problem of urbanization to the territories that were conventionally demarcated as cities. And what defines the urban in the context of Southwest India is a central problem here. Can the non-urban landscape and the production relations always be classified as rural or village? I argue in the context of Sahyadris that urbanization was equally a dynamic process of transforming socio-spatial relations across vast spaces of non-city landscapes. Specifically, urban is not a container of the city. As the radical urban geographer Neil Brunner argued in the context of metropolitan cities, metropolitan urbanization, urban can be defined as a socio-spatial relation embedded within a broader, dynamically evolving whole. Then what is required? The context of Southwest India is a systematic elaboration of spatial relation between the city, the urban agglomeration, and the hinterland, the extended landscape of urbanization, extended landscape of geographies of accumulation. The context in the colonial and also in the contemporary context, we can argue that what we portray as a countryside or hinterland, or the colonial port town has become key to the process of capitalist urbanization. And the study is premised upon David Harvey's theorization of urban process as the creation of material physical infrastructures for production, circulation, exchange, and consumption. A consistent process of configuration and reconfiguration of geographies of accumulation. So the process of urbanization in the context does not merely refer to a horizontal expansion of the material infrastructures, such as roads or canal or railway, port or market. Here we need to use the scalar concept, the urban scale, urban as a scale. Urban as a scale refers to vertical differentiation produced by concentrated labor power and capital in built spaces of material infrastructures in particular location, the production of advantageous location, by concentrating infrastructure capital and labor, also produces empty spaces elsewhere, islands of non-city spaces elsewhere. So that's we need to juxtapose these uneven terrains, variegated landscape to understand the complex geographies of urbanization. So therefore the concept urban fabric lies at the heart, at the center of this analysis. Urban not as a spatially bound, visible administrative unit, but rather urban as a the kind of socio-spatial condition distributed across space, unevenly distributed across space. So a new way of this is a new way of conceptualizing the production and continual reconfiguration of geographical differences under modern capitalism. We have, for instance, the 1990s and 2000s studies, economic history studies in the context of Kerala was dominated by world system theory analysis of, Immanuel Wallerstein's and others, world system theory analysis. It's a radical intervention that helps us to understand the political economy of underdevelopment. However, the world system theory somehow understood nation state as a unit of analysis, as a container, region as a container, and largely ignored the variegated landscape that produced inside what they consider as a regional space. Let it be Travancore, let it be Cochin, or it will be Kerala. The internally variegated landscape that formed in these spaces are important. So therefore, I argue urban is a concept that urbanization is a process, helps us to understand, critically engage, critically understand, and critically read, this landscape as an archive. We should remember that, if you carefully see historical studies in the context of Kerala or in Southwest Asia, consider geographical description as part of introductory chapter. You describe a region, then leave it there. When you describe a region and leave it there and go on to discuss another 100 years of history, then what is coming out is that you understand geographical processes as stagnant, historically stagnant, unchanging background. So there is a need to problematize that. Problematizing this attempt to consider the tendency of considering geography as a descriptive background. And critical geography help us to bring the landscape, the second nature, to the forefront of our analysis. So a student of history therefore need to go beyond basic empirical level, that is mapping and describing what is visible. What is visible is what is given is insufficient to provide a critical historical perspective. What is required is a critical perspective to understand what is real, not what is given. Critical engagement, critical studies. Critical studies should help us to differentiate what is given and what is real. Only then we can imagine, what is possible, a better future. So, for instance, in the context of Southwest India, and South India largely, if you take these colonial census reports of Malabar or Travancore or Cochin, these census reports provide sufficient attention to map inland towns and port cities. And each round of colonial census that happened every 10 years followed criteria developed by English commercial geography on urbanization. English commercial geography of urbanization, or the resource mapping geography. As the growth of visible, then they understand urbanization as the growth of the visible, discrete site called cities. And the criteria include population density, infrastructural agglomeration, and cultural specificities. The colonial reading of colonial description of geography. One of the best, there are examples to understand this. For instance, if you read Warden Corner's geographical and statistical memoirs of the survey of Travancore and Cochin, 2 volumes, this was published in the early decades of the 19th century. Or if you read F.A. Buchanan's journey from Madras through the countries of Mysore, Malabar, and Canara, again 2 volume published in 1807, and T. Whitehouse, some historical notes of Cochin on the Malabar coast, published in 1889. So all these, official, otherwise, incredible historical sources provide, a critical, provide a kind of, descriptive geographical perspective. That was fine for that time, maybe. When you write history of urbanization in the later part of the 19th century, maybe, mapping the important towns, important port centers were sufficient. But when we come to the 21st century, when we experience explosion of spaces on an everyday basis, it's insufficient, to provide a historical perspective. To follow, if we follow that, if we, uncritically follow these geographical descriptions, we need to engage these sources in a different, way. We need to provide a different, theoretical perspective to read these sources. So therefore, this uncritical acceptance of the geographical descriptions provided by English commercial geography need to be problematized. Later, if you come to the early decades of the 20th century, there are economists to engage in the issues of urbanization, the context of Kerala. For instance, P.J. Thomas. P.J. Thomas published a series of articles in the Journal of Madras Geographical Association. And his articles include, Roman trade centers on the Malabar coast. Then we have, scholars like, K. Ramavarma Raja, and his article, the Cochin Harbor and the Puduvai Pira. And there are other similar studies. They give importance to trade and port and, trade activities to map urban geography. And when we come to 1950s, they also inherit the model of city and hinterland. For instance, if you read T. Pankaj Action's, incredible, painstaking study on the study of hinterland limits of Cochin Port, this was published initially as a PhD dissertation, submitted as a PhD dissertation at the University of Pune. So he also provides this geographic, they try to inherit that English geography model of identifying a city and its primary hinterland, its secondary hinterland, and its tertiary hinterland. So in the context of Cochin. And this descriptive method is visible in the later maritime urban histories. we have a very rich tradition of maritime urban history, may not be in the context of colonial period, but earlier period. They also provide that descriptive detail of, and give centrality to trade to understand, external trade to understand, into the process of urbanization. So they consider urban centers, the port centers as externally implanted reality. That was the dominant, theoretical perspective in the 1970s, 1960s and 1970s. The modernization paradigm considered, urban centers as external influence, and they have a tendency to consider, this. If you go by Eric Wolf's idea of, Europe and people without history, they consider, urban historians unfortunately had a tendency to consider hinterland as unchanging background. Later, we have scholars like Rajat Khandre to revise that model. However, he also follows that functionalist model of considering, bazaar as a connecting link between, the external and internal, inside. So this, these documents like colonial census, the 20th century, when we come to 20th century, the important source to study urban landscape in the context of Kerala is a colonial census document, official histories like state manuals. So they also emphasized on the typology of cities. They spend much of their time to identify what type of city is it. Urbanization was equivalent to city and what type of city. And they identified variety of different types of cities that include port cities, ceremonial cities, or temple towns, administrative capital towns, industrial towns, agricultural market towns. So these scholars were spending much of their energy to identify, this type of cities. Such typologies led to a series of inconsistencies, and they overlooked or sidelined the complex process of urbanization as a generalized explosion of spaces. That means, urban landscapes and studies on urbanizations were limited to city boundary. And this produced, the production of, as a result, the production of deeply unstable, polarized and variegated geographies of colonial capitalism, or produced through the process of capitalist accumulation, capital accumulation, remain somewhat ignored. However, the task of decoding the complex urban geographies are limited by the tyranny of typologies that dominated the studies on urbanization in the first part of the 20th century. I would call it, the methodology of cityism. So this include, these sources include census reports, administrative reports, state manuals. All these require a different reading. So, for instance, the context of Southwest India, one should ask, should the princely state capital automatically be categorized as urban? Let it be Travancore, let it be, Tripunithara, or other spaces, or Aluva earlier, not 20th century Aluva, later, earlier. So then what defines urban there? If the seat of the Prince of Travancore is considered, Prince of Cochin is considered as urban center, then that need to be problematized. So then the problem we encounter here is that historians tend to consider urbanization as a background parameter to locate a transformation of social relations and political relations. However, I would like to point out one important study that made it, incredible attempt to theorize the process of urbanization in the context of Kerala is by T.T. Srikumar. In his MPhil dissertation, Urban Process in Kerala, 1900 and 1981. And later this was published as an article in EPW. So T.T. Srikumar problematized the issue of urbanization as a theoretical problem. He used the term rurban, rural plus urban, to refer to the high spatial dispersion of the towns in Southwest India. Southwest India has a specific type of landscape that we cannot identify. We cannot argue that this is village, this is a proper village, this is a proper town. This is geographically dispersed. So therefore, T.T. Srikumar used that concept urban, rural plus urban. However, Srikumar's study also attempted to demarcate the urban as a discrete space in contrast to non-urban space. That functional categorization was predominant when we try to club both rural and urban. So except Srikumar's intervention, the question of geographical transformation remained mostly as part of introductory sections of studies on colonialism or modern formation of Southwest India. And we have a number of studies that problematizes the issue of city and urbanization that include K.T. Ramohan's PhD, Material Process and Developmentalism, Han Sheng's work on views on Alapi, urbanism as a way of life, and T. Pankaj's study on Cochin, and V. Shankar Narayan's urbanization in Kerala and Tamil Nadu, some contrast. And there are many other. Yes, Chattopadhyay's urbanization in Kerala. This was published in Geographical Review of India in 1988. So however, while building on these existing studies, while benefiting from these the sources and archives provided by earlier studies, I would argue this urbanization itself as a process of social formation demand further theoretical integration to give critical perspective. To understand the ongoing process of urbanization, to provide a historical perspective to the ongoing process of the production of uneven landscape, or planetary urbanization. Therefore, we need systematic attempt to reconceptualize urbanization for opening up new horizons for understanding and to provide a historical and critical perspective to contemporary urbanization. Contemporary urbanization that include social conflicts, accumulation by dispossession, massive dispossession in the name of infrastructure development, dispossession in the name of agro-business enterprises, or all kinds of violations that happen in the name of massive infrastructure projects, or special economic zones. All these require demands historians to provide a critical historical perspective that is required. So this requires, instead of limiting urban to a problem of morphology, problem of demography, and problem of spatial restructuring and administrative restructuring of the city. And this requires careful problematization of the tendency to consider city as a universally applicable historical category. The process of urbanization, we need to acknowledge that, have assumed diverse morphological forms. Instead of identifying a catalog to identify urban, identify city, what is required is the specificity, acknowledge specificities. So, and we also need to acknowledge that urban has a wide range of spatial scales and environmental context, and also political circumstances. So this also required deeper reconceptualization of inherited vocabularies for non-city spaces. Instead of categorizing non-city spaces as villages, hinterland, wilderness, we need to challenge this dominant model of distinguishing them, both analytically and spatially, from city. So therefore, instead of assuming homogeneity in the geographical notion of city, a critical historical geographical perspective need to be developed to understand urbanization as a dialectical process of homogenization differentiation, and peripheralization. And now we know that the urban experience is not limited to a spatially bounded administrative or territory called municipality or municipal corporation. One of the recent movies, Kammati Padam by Rajiv Ravi, beautifully depicts the uneven impacts of urbanization, uneven urban development in the context of Kammati Padam. So therefore, in the context of Southwest India, the attempt to demarcate the city and non-city is a difficult and problematic exercise for a geographer. So here we need to ask, can a historian contribute a critical perspective, especially in the context of Kerala? Especially in the context when every census record, starting from 1950s, redraws the apparent boundaries of towns and villages. Not even 50s, even after World War I. So historians need to problematize the ahistorical typologies that are visible in the colonial or official histories, as cities, villages, hills. Or we need to, this is a time to revise the dominant, well-accepted notion called, dividing this Kerala into Malanadu, Idanadu, and Thira Pradesham. We need to challenge, we need to revise and reconceptualize such geographical descriptions as, Malanadu, Idanadu, and Thira Pradesham as separate geographical entities. We need a new conceptual categorize and analytical frame to understand the variegated landscape and urbanization that are not confined spatially to spatially bound and discrete territory called the city. So therefore, my argument here is that urbanization was a relentless process of operationalization of non-city, non-urban landforms as a dialectical process of spatial integration, differentiation, and fragmentation. In other words, what I argue here, a history of the urban agglomeration, a city like Cochin, can be understood only when we understand the development of city as a process intertwined with, integrated with this large-scale operationalization of non-city spaces like the Sahyadri Hills. So here I would use Henry Lefebvre's conceptualization of the production of spatial relation of capitalism as a threefold process of homogenization, fragmentation, and hierarchization. So in the context of Sahyadris, if you take this development of plantation, history of plantation, there is a tendency to consider history of plantation as a history of development, history of progress. However, this large-scale transformation of non-city spaces included the dispossession of people and their livelihood pattern through territorial enclosures, appropriation of forest as landscape for agro-business enterprises, the development of large-scale infrastructural investment projects such as hill roads, railways, dams for hydroelectric projects, ropeways, etc. The growth of the metropolitan colonial cities, that include Bombay and Cochin, was facilitated through the uneven integration of natural riches as commodities. The non-city spaces, therefore, cannot be reduced as a mere hinterland background landscape, but we need to consider them as extended landscapes of urbanization. That means this requires unsettling of the category, unsettling this typology called urban. So, so the space of non-city landscapes of Sahyadris have been continuously operationalized to facilitate energy sources, commodities, and raw materials for city building process during the times of colonial capitalism. So how much time I have? 5 minutes?
Please go on. It's okay.
Okay, yeah. So, so now I'm skipping some parts, so otherwise I will not be able to, so as I have argued, the studies on colonial ports, studies on maybe in the context of Alleppey or Cochin, to an extent Calicut, considered the Sahyadris as non-urban outside or wilderness. Let it be Wayanad or Travancore Hills or Cochin Hills. So that means the fertile valleys guarded by high mountains remain merely as descriptive details. So we have important studies in the to understand the history of plantations by Polly Back's study on plantation production, Ravi Raman's work on global capital and peripheral labor, and Merlin Boucher's study on colonial forest exploitation, the Western Ghats, and Uma Devi's plantation economy, the third world economy, then Dick Guiman. The list is long. We have and most of these studies published in 1980s and 1990s, early 2000s, were influenced by the dependency theory and world system analysis. And they gave importance to, or they subscribed the terminology called plantation, metropolitan plantation, or plantation as a universally applicable category, plantation as an island, as an implant, plantation as external to that indigenous landscape. So the plantation often appears as a universally applicable category, context. In the context of Sahyadri's Western Ghats, we have coffee plantations, tea plantation, rubber plantation, Shingona plantation, teak plantation. So this, however, these inherited vocabularies for describing a plantation are locked into an external framework, externalist framework. And they provide a linear narrative. First you have coffee, then you have tea, then you have rubber. Somehow these analyses lost themselves in that, inside plantations. So therefore the massive process of appropriating the evergreen forest and the urbanization of natural riches remain outside the concern of majority of the studies on plantation. However, today we need vocabularies to interpret and map these variegated territories, extreme landscapes, and ecologies of urbanization. That helps us to revise the binary model of city and wilderness. That provides a historical perspective to analyze what we see in front of us. When you go to Sahyadris, Munnar, it's more than a city. When you go to other spaces, it's urbanized spaces. So the Sahyadris, I argue that historically, Sahyadris was not exterior to the urban landscape. It was a crucial terrain, essential to the production of urban agglomeration like Cochin. It was a process of appropriating an extended landscape of hills, waterfalls, slopes, elephant tracks as extractive landscape to supply food crops, raw material, and energy sources to the metropolitan industries. For instance, this this thick landscape, emerged. This is a map from James Philly Archive in Glasgow. So there, see the geographical imagination. That thick line, you can see that dark thick line is interconnecting that Munnar Hills and the port city of Cochin and the port city. So the formation of this landscape, this require a careful reading. How do we read this map? This early 20th century map. Where do we locate urban here? Where do we distinguish this is urban and this is village in this this thick map that you could see in front of you? I hope this map is not blurred. I hope it's clear to an extent.
Justin, do you have the presentation mode on? I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, it's not visible, the presentation. Just a second then.
I'm not sure. I can't see it. Can anyone else see?
No, ma'am.
Okay, let me just...
No, I think yeah.
Okay, then...
It was there a while ago. I think that device, is it from another device that you signed in? For the
Yeah.
Yeah, it's coming. Yeah, fine. It's coming.
It's
Yeah.
coming, right? So this thick map that you could see in front of you, where to kind of, identify, this is city and this is a village space. This is countryside. This is wilderness. So that's a problem. This is an early 20th century map, not a colonial, not an official map. Official map is different. They don't give, so much details when they study. This is a view of, this is the way a planter, a trader, a merchant would perceive landscape. They can't ignore, they can't overlook the urban tissues, urban fabric that's there. That's important for them. So this the archive speaks in it, itself. It's the perspective that is required. So this, for instance, the way this, I hope this table can demonstrate the way, this intertwined process of urbanization, massive operationalization of landscape in the Nellyampadi hills. The 1860s was, was part of urban concentration of natural riches as coffee. For instance, if you go to ports like ports in UK, Holland, or Antwerp, or Hamburg, Hawaii, or none of these have coffee, coffee plantation hinterland there. So it was basically export from, this coffee producing region that include the Sahyadris. So that required, the coffee production required large scale operationalization of this landscape that include, that does not exclude environmental destruction, massive destruction of forest landscape that you could see in front of you in Munnar, and this is a plantation, view of a plantation, a thick space that is produced in the, the later decades of the 19th century. This is the Brook-Bond Company, Brook-Bond tea estate in Nellyampadies, right? So, and these kind of thick spaces of infrastructure that developed in the later part of the 19th century and the early decades of the 20th century, that, or I would use the term operationalization of the hillscape, facilitated massive appropriation of nature as commodity in the later part of the 19th century onwards. So this, what you see in front of you is the construction of a Munnar Neriyamangalam, road. The coolie laborers from Tamil plains are engaged in the construction of road. So interconnecting this, Cochin, this road is a nerve, it's an artery interconnecting, as you know now, Munnar and Munnar region, Anjanad Valley and Cochin. So the princely states of Travancore, princely state of Cochin and the government of Madras diverted a major portion of the state revenue to develop these roads at the cost of, small peasant-dominated regions were ignored elsewhere and developed these plantation hills. And this is a Cochin State tramway that you could see in front of you, and that, we have Sebastian Joseph's work on, Cochin State tramway, beautiful, important work. So within 15 years' time, 2.5 lakh hectares forest were cleared and exported from, this space. So these thick spaces of infrastructures, operational landscape, was constitute, the kind of, constitutive insider of urbanization of Cochin, or the concentrated urbanization of Cochin or Bombay. These studies required such, this critical perspective. So, maybe I stop here, and later I can take up other aspect when we discuss. There are some more aspects to share, but yeah, I have summarized, I think, mostly. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for this insightful lecture. Sir, you have enlightened us by talking about the critical urban theory and historical geography of urbanization in the colonial context. I will open the session for the queries. How the princely state of Cochin did support the capitalist urbanization and its development? Was it an effect of the princely policies?
Yeah. So that, yeah. All right. Okay. So that I have, to an extent, I have discussed this. I think this aspect that princely state. I do not consider princely state and colonial, planters or colonial bureaucracy as the binary opposites. They are part of both the Travancore and Cochin princely state, the part of the colonial, social relations that developed in the 19th and 20th century. So obviously, as I have mentioned, a princely state diverted major portion of their state revenue, and the state revenue is basically tax. Initially, all kinds of poll taxes and land revenue, to develop, roads, hydroelectric infrastructures, and all other facilities to integrate these hills to the world market of commodity. So therefore, the princely state, for instance, the public works department policies of the princely state, that is kind of very well documented in their administrative reports and other legislative council proceedings, provide us a critical perspective to understand how this uneven urbanization that happened in the later part of the 19th and early 20th century led to intense social conflicts. This was not a one-sided story. There were obviously, powerful oppositions against, these princely state policies. So that include, the oppositions, the way tribal population opposed, the expansion of plantations to, and even indigenous elites and their kind of, for instance, Malayalam Manorama supported the interest of rich peasantry, mostly, Alappuzha and Kottayam region. So they realized that, the Travancore princely state, for a decade, Travancore princely state diverted 60% of its PWD budget to develop Kottayam, Kumuli Road, the present-day Kottayam Kumuli Road. And Manorama had this beautiful habit of writing editorials in English. One of their English editorial, because the English editorials are meant, for the Divan, either Bengali Divan or British Divan, who cannot obviously read Malayalam. So Malayalam Manorama called Department of Public Works, Travancore, they used to write DPW, Department of Public Work. The expansion of Manorama wrote, the expansion of DWP is not Department of Public Work. It's the Department of Public Waste. That people are not benefiting. This, colonial planters are benefiting. So what I'm saying is that, even inside the princely state, one should not consider princely state as a monolithic, unit, a social unit. There were internal conflicts inside the princely states, to shape, that also played a crucial role in shaping the urban landscape, uneven urban landscape in this last 2 centuries. Yeah, thank you.
Next question we have from us, Gopika, research scholar, SSS Kaladi. How did and political sovereignty led to urbanization in southwestern princely India and not in British Malabar, which among other things was directly under colonial rule.
Who asked that question? Can you point out? I can read.
Gopika from the Department of History.
Go.
Sir, the query is in chat box.
That I'm trying to find out. So, unable to. Or can you read once again? I can't read. I can't see that.
Yeah. How did the colonial initiative for monopoly of trade and political sovereignty led to urbanization in southwestern princely India, that is, in the kingdoms of Cochin and Travancore, and not in British Malabar, which among other things was directly under colonial rule?
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's not part of today's discussion, but to give you a brief reply, you just need to take the history of the port city of Alapura. So Alapura emerged as an important port center as a response to the colonial free trade policy. The British, after 1830s, 1840s, introduced the principle of free trade. We call it free trade imperialism, free access to every corner of this planet, to provide free access. The British private capital and their interest. However, the princely state of Travancore was not ready to give up its feudal rights. I would use the term feudal rights that include pepper monopoly, tobacco monopoly, and other monopolies. So the 1840s, 1850s, Cochin, under the British, was a free trade port. That a port where you don't have to pay duty, monopoly duty. Otherwise, if you produce anything in Travancore, if you produce pepper in Travancore, that belongs to the princely, the princely state, the department. You get a fixed price that we never know the real value. It would go to the monopoly, state right. So then what people do, they try to escape this monopoly by smuggling, pepper and other agricultural products, exportable crop from, Kottayam to Cochin. Midnight, they, have their country boat to smuggle and cross, the country border, the princely state border to Cochin territory, or the prince, to cross that Kyle and reach Cochin. But this was not easy. Okay, this led to major bloodshed. Thousands of people died, killed by both princely state police, Travancore princely state police, and the Cochin princely state police to oppress smuggling. So this, what I'm trying to tell you is that the emergence of port towns, if you are asking that, was equally a political process. It's connected to the political development of the time. Rise and decline, growth and decline of Alapi is connected to, in that sense, the policies of the princely state. The moment, the princely state, 1865, the government of India passed the Interportal Trade Convention. Interportal Trade Convention passed by the government of India took away the right of princely state to have their monopoly rights. Once the Travancore princely state lost its monopoly, immediately Alapi port lost its significance as a monopoly port, because Cochin was an advantageous port where you have British and other indigenous merchants and other facilities. So that's there. I mean, it's not one-sided colonial policy. We also need to give, what I'm trying to tell you is that, we need to give agency to the princely state, power of the princely state. They also played crucial role they had conflict and consensus with the colonial authorities. So one should study this interconnected history of Alleppey and Cochin, the political history of Alleppey and Cochin, to understand a significant role played by the princely state. Yeah.
The next question is also from Gopika. Could you explain how did commercialized agriculture and allied trading activities were instrumental in reorganizing the geography as well as the social and economic relations of various landscapes?
That requires another 1 hour, Gopika. That's what I was trying to explain now in last 45 minutes in the context of Sahyadris. Yeah, we can, I think, go to next question.
The next questions are from Anish R. In this theoretical understanding of urbanization as a process, do all conceptual categories of urban, rural, or hinterland fall as a pack of cards?
I would not use the term cards or anything, but this is the interconnected, as I have mentioned, we need to understand this as a dialectical process of, move towards homogenization, fragmentation, and hierarchization. It's a dialectical process. It's not as the pack of cards that you can take one by one, not like that. It's an integrated whole, dynamically integrated whole with polymorphic geographies of, but if you're asking that, Anisha, urban does not eliminate non-urban. It reproduces peripheries. Extended landscape of urbanization reproduces peripheries and islands of, remote areas. So that's also there. So that's what I meant by, that we need a, polymorphic morphology to understand, urban. Urban does not, eliminate rural or hinterland, but we need to understand rural and hinterland countryside wilderness as constitutive inside of urban. Yeah.
Next question is also from Anish. Do in any histories of urbanization, starting from early historical societies, urban centers emerged as its own rather than through the villages of non-urban societies?
Yeah. So there are two immediate responses to that. I don't know. I'm not an expert to answer that early historic urbanization. My focus is colonial urbanization. So in that, and second, I do not consider transformation of village as city, that kind of linear progressive model as urbanization. That's not the thing. It's uneven, simultaneous, and variegated process. So that means, it's not a horizontal process of conversion of, transforming villages into cities. Rather, it's a vertical process of appropriation of, non-city, non-urban landscape as, commodities, as resources, as energy, and, operational landscape, operationalization of non-urban landscape. Yeah.
Next question is from Samyukta Shashikumar. Is it good enough to depend on colonial archives and such records to look at the process of urbanization? How to transcend the limitations of archival materials that are largely for administrative intentions?
Of course, I here in my presentation, Samyukta, I was trying to, present landscape itself as an archive. Not, we don't need to always prioritize written records. Written records are important, but there is no need to go for the tyranny of written records, right? And I don't know, the colonial I don't know what do we mean by colonial archive. Colonial archive also provide us, a different, set of sources. For instance, if you read James Finlay's archive, that is not exactly administrative archive, but a mercantile archive, that will help you to write a beautiful social history of Sahyadris, because they document everything. For whatever purpose, whatever administrative requirement, whatever surveillance requirement, they documented. For instance, they counted number of cows, number of pastoral communities, number of village tribes, who occupied a particular locality, and they also documented their letters. For instance, I could recover a letter written by a group of villagers to Travancore Diwan and also the resident complaining against a planter, that a planter is trying to levy on tax on this grazing land. So therefore, we need to go explore different layers of archives to write write a social history of these spaces. Yeah, thank you.
Hopefully, this is the question for this.
There's a question from Akhil. Akhil, Shrija, can you see that?
Yes, ma'am, I will read that.
Yeah, please.
Do you think urbanization as a process had impact in marginalized groups such as craftsmen and other skilled groups of Kerala?
Yeah, of course. Of course, I think that's what I have argued here. They're not outside, they are inside, right? Yeah, so then...
No, there's a last one. Shrija, can you see that, Subairat?
Yeah. Sir,
yeah.
His research topic is hinterland economy and the mercantile world of Calicut. Sir, briefly, how was port hinterland connection in pre-colonial Calicut? Can you suggest materials related to this area?
I think I'm not an expert to suggest anything on pre-colonial Calicut. I'm sure that Dr. Abhilash Malayal would be the right person to answer this. You may contact him. One thing is that my research is not on Calicut and not pre-colonial. Yeah.
Next question is from Aparna. What are the limitations of the studies on contradictory space?
I don't see any limitation there, but it's a possibility in itself. It's a contradictory space is a perspective. Instead of considering space as a neutral, mute category, we can understand the concept contradictory space as a space where we have this option to understand the way different social groups participate, different interests participate in the historical transformation, social spatial transformation. So therefore, it's not a limitation, but it opens up a lot of possibilities. Yeah.
I think the queries are over. It was indeed a wonderful discussion. Thank you, sir, for answering all of the questions so patiently. Now, I would like to invite Jose Kuriakos, Research Scholar, Department of History, for the vote of thanks. Over to you, Jose.
Thank you, Srija. It's my pleasure to thank Dr. Justin Mathew, Assistant Professor, Hansraj College, University of Delhi. Indeed, he challenged and enriched our perspective regarding the topic, critical geography and rethinking the history of urbanization in the context of colonialization. Really, it was an informative and enlightening session. On behalf of the Department of History, Sri Shankaracharya University, Kaladi, we extend our heartfelt gratitude to the wonderful lecture. Thank you, sir. I also thank all the participants of today's lecture. Once again, thanking you all.
Thank you all. Thank you, Dr. Justin, for this excellent presentation. Very inspiring presentation. So glad you could make it today. Yeah.
Thanks for
Thank
this
you all.
opportunity.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you all for your participation. We meet again tomorrow, same time, 6 p.m. For Jasira's presentation on Iron Age, early historic periods in the history of Kerala. Thank you so much. Bye.